you name it, monetary, fiscal, credit, 20 different programs. Because of that, I think that the risk of a near depression has been somewhat reduced. I don't think that there is zero probability, but we probably are not going to end up in a near depression. We learned some of the lessons, as Paul said, from the Great Depression, even from Japan. However, now the consensus is becoming optimistic again and says that we're going to go from minus 6% growth to positive growth in the second half of the year, meaning the recession is going to be over in June. By Q4, they estimate that growth is going to be positive 2%, and next year, more than 2%, so back to potential. Now, compared to this new consensus that got it wrong in the past, my views are much more bearish. I would agree that the rate of economic contraction is slowing down. If we had to keep on having the free fall of the last 2 quarters, we'll end up in another Great Depression, and the policy action reducing that, but we're still contracting at a pretty fast rate. I see the economy contracting all the way through the end of the year, so reaching from -6, -2, not +2. And next year, the growth rate of the economy is going to be so low, 0.5% as opposed to 2% plus of the consensus. And the unemployment rate already this year is going to be above 10%, and more likely close to 11% next year, that even next year is going to feel like a recession, even if we are technically out of the recession. And the outlook for Europe and Japan, both this year and next year, is even worse. So most advanced economies are going to do even worse than the United States for a number of reasons. Structural factors in Japan, weak policy response in the case of the Eurozone. Now, the financial problem, the financial system, in my view, are still severe. Many banks are still insolvent. I agree. If you don't want to end up like Japan with zombie banks, as Bill Bradley suggested, it's better to do what Sweden did. Take over the banks, clean them up, separate good and bad assets, and sell them back in short order to the private sector. Now, on the question of the policy response, there was a bit of a debate between Niall and Paul. And I think that while I'm closer to the views of Paul, I think there is some grain of truth about what Niall says in the following sense. There is no inconsistency between monetary easing and fiscal easing. Both of them should be stimulating demand, and the monetary easing should be leading also to restoration of credit. Of course, in a situation in which the problems of the economy are problems of not just illiquidity, but also of solvency, traditional monetary policy doesn't work. You also have to do unconventional stuff, and you have to fix the banks. And we need the fiscal stimulus because every component of aggregate demand is collapsing. Consumption, residential investment, capex spending, non-residential construction, inventories, exports. The only thing can go up and sustain the economy for the time being is fiscal policy. However, there are caveats. The caveat is monetary policy cannot resolve problems of credit, first of all. Secondly, fiscal policy is not without cost. We need in the short run, we're going to add about $9 trillion to US public debt. If you think about the problem of the economy, Niall said it's the end of the age of leverage. It's not really. There is no deleveraging. We have all the liabilities of the households, of the banks, of the corporates, and now we decided to socialize these losses and to put them on the back of the balance sheet of the government. That's why the public debt is rising. When you have a debt problem, you have to convert it into equity. That's what you do with corporate restructure. You convert some unsecured debt into equity. That's what you should do with the banks. Take the unsecured creditors and convert their claims into equity. The same thing you could do with the households, reduce their mortgages and have an upside for the creditor in terms of a warrant. What we're doing is not the debt into equity conversion. What we're doing is piling more debt on top of more debt. And at some point, the back of the sovereign is going to break, and when that's going to happen, it's going to be a disaster. So we need fiscal stimulus short run, but we have to worry about the long run too.
Thank you, Nouriel. There'll be time to, there will be plenty of time to flesh some of this out. Mr. Soros.
Well, I think it's fairly obvious by now that we are in a difficult situation. There are two features that I think deserve to be pointed out. One is that the financial system, as we know it, actually collapsed. After the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers on September 15, the financial system really ceased to function and had to be put on artificial life support. And at the same time, the financial shock had a tremendous effect on the real economy. And the real economy went into a free fall. and that was global, and international trade was the one that was actually collapsed more than economic activity. It was the worst hit. The other feature is that the system collapsed of its own weight. And that contradicted the prevailing view, the governing view about financial markets, namely that they tend towards equilibrium, and that equilibrium is disturbed by extraneous forces, outside shocks. And you have then divergences from that equilibrium, but they occur in a random fashion. But basically, markets are self-correcting. And that paradigm has been proven to be false. So we are dealing not only with the collapse of a financial system, but also with the collapse of a worldview. And a collapse like this, generally, events always outpace people's ability to understand what's happening. So the response is always lagging behind the problem. And policies that could have worked at one point no longer work at the next. So that's the situation that President Obama inherited. Now, in these circumstances, he's faced with a double objective, two objectives. One, you have to arrest the collapse, arrest and, if possible, reverse the collapse. And second, you have to reconstruct the system, because it cannot be reconstructed the way it was. It can't be restored. So this is a different situation. And when people compare this with other previous financial crises, they're making a mistake. Now, the interesting thing is that what you need to do in the short term is almost exactly the opposite of what needs to be done in the long term. Because obviously the problem was excessive leverage. But when you have a collapse of credit, you then have to, and there's only one source of credit that is still credible, and that's the state, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury. And then you have to actually inject a lot more leverage and money effectively. You have to print money as fast as you can, expand the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, increase the national debt. And that is, in fact, what has been done, which is the right thing to do, but then you have to once this policy is successful, you will then have to drain the money supply as fast as the credit expands. So in the circumstances, I would say that policy generally lagged behind events. We were behind the curve. Now that the free fall is moderating and the space of the collapse has more or less occurred, I think we have a good hope that policy will in fact catch up with events. And I actually hope it will be very interesting what's going to happen in the next 10 days with the stress test, because that's basically where the policy has been lagging behind in recapitalizing the banks. And that's where most of the confusion and distress comes from. But if the stress test is really used to give a realistic picture of the banks.